to just spend the next few minutes just kind of sharing some thoughts with you guys that have kind of been birthed over the last few months. I came into 2022 probably a little bit more exhausted and a little bit more tired than I realized. Several months ago, I started reading a book by Mark Yaconelli called The Gift of Hard Things. Mark is a speaker and a writer. His father, Mike Yaconelli, wrote several books that I highly recommend and that I love. And Mike was an incredible pastor and an incredible speaker. And Mike passed away, probably close to 17 or 18 years ago. I had the privilege of being at the last conference that he ever spoke at here in Charlotte. And so he tragically passed away the next day. And so his son Mark was writing a book, just kind of some memoirs based on some hard seasons of his life that he had walked through. And how oftentimes we come through these hard seasons and we get on the backside of them and we feel like, I've made it, my head's above water, and then we kind of brace and prepare ourselves for the next one, not always looking back and seeing where God was in the midst of those. And so I want to just kind of share some thoughts and perspectives today that the Lord laid on my heart and kind of walked me through over the last few months. This kind of thought for this message started a few weeks ago. I was in my backyard playing fetch with our dog Jupiter. Now, just to give a little bit of backstory, this dog Jupiter, I did not want this dog. It was not my choice to get this dog, but let me explain why. It's not that. I'll just go ahead and tell you, I probably love this dog more than I've ever loved any dog before, and that's saying a lot when you understand what I'm about to share with you. So I'm in the backyard playing fetch with this dog, and this dog is like the perfect family dog for us. Like, all of my kids love him. He loves all of them. He fetches. He does a lot of the things that my previous dog did not do. And I'm in the backyard, and I'm playing fetch with him, and I'm just thinking about how much I love this dog, but how hard it's been to get to this point, to where I like this dog probably more than any dog I've ever had. And the reason it's a big deal is because last May, June, we had to unexpectedly put down our dog Bree. And to say that I loved Bree, to say that Bree was my best friend is an understatement. Like, I can't tell you the connection that I had with this dog. So Bree was a Christmas gift 10 years prior from my wife. And it was something that I asked for. I didn't at first. She was like, no, we're not getting a dog. And then she got me this dog because I had transitioned off of staff here, and I was serving as a local missionary running Capstone, and our office was over off of Pitt School Road at a house that Crossroads owned. And so my office was there. I was on the property by myself most of the day, and then a lot of the programs that I would run, I would have to commute back and forth to, and I would do a lot of that by myself. And I would end up in the national forest setting up stuff by myself and tearing stuff down. And so I knew that I was going to be alone a lot, and I like to talk, and I don't like to be alone. And so I wanted a dog. Like, I wanted something to keep me company. And so Katie got me this dog. And Bree was my dog. She loved our kids. She loved Katie, but she was not very engaging with them. Definitely did not fetch. You could throw the ball and she would look at it and go, you got 2 legs, you can go get that. Right? Like, that was not her personality, but she went everywhere with me. She ran programming with me. She went to the office with me. Even when I came back on staff here, she just continued to come to work with me every day and would, go around to different staff members' offices and lay in their office. And she was an amazing dog, and we had to put her down unexpectedly, and it was a horrible thing to walk through. I remember the night that the vet called and said, hey, unfortunately, she's got cancer all over. We're going to have to, I recommend putting her down. There's some options that we could try that would get you 6 more months, but he's like, there's nothing we can do. And so the next morning I had to get my kids out of school. I had to tell Katie what we were doing, and we drove up there, and it was raining, and everybody had to say goodbye outside in the rain. It was just kind of like this really weird, awkward moment. And then they're going to put her down. And I promised her that I would be there all the way to the end, and I was going to fulfill my promise. And so I put the kids in the car, and my wife left the parking lot while I stayed there, and I laid down beside her, and I held her until she took her last breath. And so I was just devastated, and I did not want another dog. But I'm only one of 5 in my household, so I was quickly outvoted. So a few weeks later, Katie comes up with this idea to get this other dog, and I was like, we're not getting another dog. And then we got another dog, and I'm like, I'm not going to like this dog, and then I like this dog, and so now I love this dog. And that got me to thinking about really 2021 as a whole. Now, over these last few years, I'm sure all of us have walked through some stuff, and I don't claim to know what you've walked through, but I'm just going to share a little bit about my experience for 2021. So in the fall of 2020, I accepted the interim position here at the church as the youth pastor until such time that we could hire someone. And I really wasn't sure what 2021 was going to hold or what the future of our ministry at Capstone and at Cedar Grove were going to be. And it became apparent towards the end of 2020 that I was not going to be returning to that, and I was offered and accepted the position of the family pastor here at the church. And while I was excited to accept that position, there was some grief and some loss and some mourning for the decade that I had just spent in the ministry that I was in. There was a lot of uncertainty about how this transition was going to go with my family, what this was going to mean for Capstone, a ministry that Bobby and I had started and poured our heart and soul into, and was this going to be the end, and what was this going to look like? Fast forward a few months later, and my dog gets sick, and I end up putting her down. Fast forward a few months later, and my father gets COVID and becomes very sick and ends up in the hospital and then turns into ICU. And then my mother gets sick and she winds up in the hospital and then ICU. And then my father passes away. And then I'm trying to walk through the grief of that, but my mother is still in the hospital sick, and we're not sure if she's going to make it. And so, for several weeks there, it was kind of this uncertainty of what was going to happen. I mean, I was faced with the reality I might not just lose one parent, but both parents. And then a few months later, it became very apparent with everything that was going on politically and with just the choices that were being made and the climate that my wife was working in, that she needed to leave her full-time position. It was not, while we needed the money financially, the emotional and physical and mental burden that it was taking on her, it was just time for her to transition out. So by the time 2022 rolls around, I'm tired and I'm exhausted. And so walking kind of through this has been very helpful for me. So I want to kind of share some thoughts and ideas with you. I made it simple. There are 5 P's that we're going to use. Just because it was easy and it sounded cool to do 5 P's. I don't know. But anyway, so we're gonna do 5 P's. I'm going to paraphrase for us a story from the Bible that many of you are probably familiar with. I'm going to be in the book of Daniel, and I'm going to paraphrase chapter 1 through 3, and then I'm going to come back and kind of hit some high points in chapter 3. So just bear with me as I paraphrase. If you have not studied or read this, I encourage you to do it. There is way more content in these first 3 chapters than what I can paraphrase in the next few minutes. I hope that as I'm going through this, you will see some parallels between what the children of Israel were facing then and what you and I as the body of Christ face now. I'm going to deliberately pull out a couple of things that will hopefully help you see the truth in what I'm sharing with you. So let's just dive in. So the book of Daniel opens up, and the children of Israel, the Jews have been defeated by Babylon. And the king of Babylon is Nebuchadnezzar. And he has taken Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as prisoners of war. And he has brought them back, and he has ordered that the four of them be trained in their traditions and customs and things like that, because he has found that they are very suited for learning and education and things like that, that they can read, they can write. They're highly intelligent individuals. So let's train them. And then once they are trained in our traditions and our customs, then we are going to put them to work in the service of the king. And through this process, Daniel found favor with the king, because the king had had a dream, and he had asked all of his enchanters and wise men and advisors and astrologers to interpret this dream. None of them have been able to do this successfully, and so Daniel is able to interpret his dream. And this buys him favor with the king, and so he elevates Daniel to ruler over all of Babylon and all of the wise men. And Daniel asked the king to appoint Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego as kind of administrators over this providence, while Daniel himself remains at the palace in the service of the king with the royal court. And his request is granted. So Daniel is working alongside the king. This is King Nebuchadnezzar, not a follower of God, but he has appointed Daniel as a trusted advisor. He has also appointed 3 godly men as the administrator over Babylon. And despite this influence, Nebuchadnezzar decides to make a large golden statue. And he presents this statue, and he orders all of the political leaders and all of the advisors and all of the people of influence to come and behold this creation that he has made and had made, and to marvel at all of its glory and at who he is. So just to be clear, our earthly ruler elevates themselves to a place of significance and importance, and then expects all of the people around them to marvel at the work that they've done. And some of the people tickle the ear of the king and go, hey, what would be a great idea is if you order that at a certain time when instruments are played and everything, that everybody bows down and worships this statue. And so Nebuchadnezzar makes that decree. But Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego refuse to do this. And the punishment for doing this will be that anyone who fails to do this will be thrown into the fiery furnace. So when they fail to do this, some of the other leaders go to the king and go, hey, these Jewish dudes that you've put in power, they're not following that. They're not bowing down and worshiping the king and following his decree. And so this earthly leader, when the people of God would not yield to his wishes, became very angry. And he brought them before him, and he gave them one more chance. And they said, look, we're not going to do this. And so he ordered them to be tied up and thrown into the furnace. And he was so angry that he had the furnace turned up 7 times hotter. In fact, the people that threw them in the fire got burned up in the process. And as they're standing there waiting for them to be consumed, Nebuchadnezzar and others look into the fire, and they see a 4th figure walking around in the fire. And he yells for the 3 of them, and they come to him, and he realizes that they are unharmed, and he brings them out, and he falls down, and he praises God, the God of Israel, and he reinstates and promotes them back to positions of authority. So let me just unpack 5 takeaways that you and I can get from this. First and foremost, I want to start with pressure. The first P is pressure. The three of them were under constant pressure to eat forbidden foods and to bow down and worship false gods. To eat forbidden foods and to bow down to worship other gods. You and I today, as the people of God, still face that same pressure. We are still in the world even though we're not of the world. We are still in a world that promotes itself, that promotes ungodliness, that encourages you and I to gorge on the things that this culture has to offer. We see it in the things that we watch. We see it in advertisements. We see it in conversations. We are a culture consumed with money, with sex, with fame, and it permeates everything. And you and I, on a daily basis, are encouraged, invited, championed to consume. We worship all kinds of false gods, including the one that you look at in the mirror. We have elevated ourselves, we have elevated others, and we have elevated things to a place of authority and a place of worship in our lives. In Romans 12, verse 2, we are reminded, this is a letter to the church. We are reminded of these things. Do not conform to the patterns of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and prove that what God's will is, His good, pleasing, and perfect will. The letter to the church reminds us that we need to be transformed by the renewing of our mind, that we live in a culture and a world that is constantly trying to convince us to worship false idols. There is constant and real pressure. The next is a promise. There are two types of promise. First is the fire. We are promised fire. The reason we're promised fire is we know that the pressure is real. When we stand on the truth and the foundation of who God is, you can expect an earthquake. You can expect the ground to shake. You can expect the fire to come. Isaiah 43:1 says this. But now, this is what the Lord said. He who created you, Jacob, who formed you, Israel, do not fear, for I have redeemed you. I have summoned you by name. You are mine. When you pass, listen to this part. When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. When you pass through the rivers, they will not sweep over you. When you walk through the fire, you will not be burned. The flames will not set you ablaze. God is not going to save you from the fire. He's going to bring you through the fire. When you walk through the fire of cancer, when you walk through the fire of death, when you walk through the fire of divorce, financial ruins, when you walk through those fires, and those fires are coming, He's not going to save you from the fire. He's going to save you in the fire. When threatened with the furnace and threatened with and offered another opportunity to bow down and worship the false god, this is what Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego said in Daniel 3:16 through 18. King Nebuchadnezzar, we do not need to defend ourselves before you in this matter. If we are thrown into the blazing furnace, the God we serve is able to deliver us from it, and he will deliver us from your majesty's hands. But even if he does not, we want you to know, your majesty, that we will not serve your gods or worship the image of gold you have set up. We are promised fire, and we are promised three things after the fire. I remember years ago, I was talking to a gentleman here at the church, and I can't remember what brought it up, but we were talking about how gold is purified. And they were talking about how to purify gold, you take raw gold and you put it in a furnace and you begin to melt it, and the impurities begin to burn off, and you take it out and you let it cool down and you put it back in the fire and it burns off more impurities, and you bring it back out and you put it back in there, and each time this process burns away more and more impurity, and so what you're left with is a more pure form of gold than what you started with. God promises us fire because it's part of his plan to purify you and I. Our faith, our hope, our assurance are purified by the fire. Pressure, promise, protection. While we know that we're going to have pressure, while we know that we are going to have fire, we are also offered protection. See, most of us, we're taught culturally to expect protection outside of the fire, not in the fire, right? Like most of our technology, everything in our lives that we consume, most of it is to make our lives easier and better, and so that we can avoid these hard things. But the miracle is found in the fire. I mean, aren't you glad that Christ was not protected from the cross? Right? Like it was the purification that happened for you and I because he faced the fire. When Nebuchadnezzar threw the three into the fire, it says that in Daniel 3:25, he said, "Look, I see 4 men walking in the fire, unbound and unharmed. The fourth looks like the Son of God." We expect a miracle outside of the fire. We thought God would save us before this thing got too bad. But for us, the miracle is found in the fire, in the purification process. His protection is made perfect when we stand firm under the pressure, when we walk through the fire. Pressure, promise, protection, peace. This is the hardest one for most of us. It's the hardest one for me, to find peace in the fire. To find peace when everything is going wrong around me. But Jesus says this in John 16:33. "I have told you these things so that in me you may have peace. In this world you will have trouble. You will have trouble. But take heart, I have overcome the world." One of the most prophetic statements I ever heard anybody made during one of the fires that I was walking through years ago. I'm sitting before my mentor. I'm lamenting about the persecution and the anguish that I'm walking through. And he looked at me and he said, "Hey, where's your ... And I said, "What?" He said, "I want to teach you a phrase when you find yourselves in these moments. When you are lamenting to God about the persecution and the fire that you're walking through, I want you to remember, but God, ... No matter what you're facing, no matter what circumstances you're looking at, you have to remember that we serve a God that is capable of anything and everything. That he has a plan and a purpose for us. And his plans are good. That regardless of the circumstances, I can look and go, man, I've lost my job, but God has a plan for me. I'm struggling in my marriage, but God has a plan for me. I'm watching a loved one suffer, but God has a plan for me. Pressure, promise, protection, peace. And the last thing is promotion. As gold is purified, as the impurities are burned off, it becomes more precious, it becomes more valuable, it becomes more pure. We count it in carats. As it's elevated, it becomes more precious, it becomes more valuable, but it also becomes more costly. We are guaranteed pressure. We are promised fire. We are offered protection. We have peace. And just like the three of them, once they were out of the fire, they were reinstated and promoted. Jesus couldn't have picked 12 more unqualified people to be his disciples. There were literally thousands upon thousands of people who are far more gifted, talented, and qualified. I mean, he picked 12 guys that most of us would be uncomfortable if they were sitting in our congregation. And he pulled them out of the circumstances that they were in. And he elevated them as a disciple. And he walked with them and he lived with them. And then he said to them in Matthew 28:18, we've already talked about it this morning. Then Jesus came to them and said, "All authority in heaven and on earth has been given to me. Therefore, go and make disciples of all the nations, baptizing them, teaching them and baptizing them in the name of the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit. Teach them to obey everything I have commanded you. For surely I am with you all the days." I think about Seth's testimony, and I think about the fires that he's witnessed in people. Just think about the one testimony that he gave. One young lady who was walking through immense fire and persecution, who was pressured to do the unimaginable. And they came alongside her and they made her a disciple and they baptized her and they taught her. And now she's a staff member pouring into other people, raising a child that she was pressured to abort. Last year, he stood here in the midst of COVID on a hope and a promise that God was going to fulfill. And he left here and he came back a year later to testify that they found a place to baptize people, and they've baptized 308 people. When we withstand the pressure, when we walk through the fire, when we embrace the protection, when we walk in peace, then you and I are elevated to the position of authority that we've been given, and that is to make disciples, to usher in the presence of the kingdom of heaven, to bring life where there's death, to bring light where there's darkness, to bring hope where there's despair. As the band comes up, I want to close with a couple of thoughts. A few years ago, I was having a conversation with somebody, and we were talking about the zoo and how in the zoo they create all these, ecosystems and biodomes and stuff like that, right? And they put all these native plants in various places, and then they introduce the animals and stuff. And I can't remember what brought up the conversation. We were talking about these particular trees and how time after time after time the trees just die. They bring them in, they plant them, but the trees don't sustain, and they couldn't figure out why. Because in their minds they've created the perfect environment. It's as pristine of an environment as these trees should have ever had, except for one thing. There's no wind. And what they discovered is when the wind blows, it causes the skin on the trees to thicken, and it causes their roots to deepen. A few years ago, Bobby and I were standing on top of Grandfather Mountain, and we were looking, and we were looking on the what I think is the northwestern side of the mountain. I could have my directions off, but we noticed that that's the side of the mountain that the most of the wind comes up. There's just this constant wind blowing up that side of the mountain, and at times it's almost hurricane-force winds. And if you look at all the spruce trees and everything, almost all the branches point not into the wind, but going with the wind. And so you've got these trees that are heavily branched on one side and very few branches on the other side. But when you get down there, you see that almost all the roots grow out and into the windward side. And these trees are perfectly suited for the environment they're in. Their roots are deep and strong in the direction they need to be. Their branches lean into the south-facing sun, away from the wind, so that it minimizes their profile. In 1988, Yellowstone had a devastating fire. Scientists believe it's the worst fire in recorded history, and that the park would never recover. They deemed it an ecological disaster. Yet, just a decade later, wildlife that had been almost extinct was beginning to flourish. Invasive plants that had started to take over were destroyed. Native species that had long moved on had come back. Trees that had been sick and dying and almost non-existent were blooming and blossoming everywhere. Because the fire cleared all the dead and debris and the invasive plants. Pine trees that had not been able to reproduce for decades because of the absence of fire were suddenly coming back. All this new life was being birthed out of this process. About a year ago, our brother Walter got diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. And we began to walk through this fire with him. And we prayed and we contended and we begged God to answer prayers the way that we wanted them answered. And I can say with confidence that we did everything we should have done, that we stood firm in every way we were supposed to stand firm. And I remember the day after his celebration, the surreal feeling of just going, but God, that's not how I thought it was going to go. But in the days and weeks that followed, I began to see how we were changed in this process. That God's plan and purpose was good and perfect. It doesn't mean that it was painless. It doesn't mean that we understand. I don't know what the fire looks like for you. But I pray that you will press into the protection that he offers. That we will walk in peace. That we will step into the promotion that we're being offered. I am so thankful for some of the victories in the court system and things that have happened over the last few weeks. But if you think that the enemy is going to look at the church and go, my bad, I'll just quit, you are mistaken. If you think that the pressure isn't going to get turned up, if you think that the fire's not going to get hotter, then you haven't been reading your Bible. But if you don't do anything else, read the end, because we win. We are the people of God. We are the church. We are the bride of Christ that he lived and died for. And he will protect us in the fire. He will bring us peace, and he will set us on a hill so that we may be the light that we are called to be. I pray that you and I step into that glory this week. I pray that we're the church that we are called to be. Be blessed.